Hello and welcome to the Qualys Cybersecurity Predictions for 2026. We are embracing a risk-first era at Qualys. My name is Alex Kreilein. I'm the Vice President of Product Security and Public Sector Solutions at Qualys, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Richard Seiersen, who's our Chief Risk and Technology Officer. Rich, you want to take it away?
Sure. You're very humble in your introduction, Alex.
Oh, thanks.
Alex and I go a ways back in DC where we're doing this kind of very thing. They're not too far from steps from the White House, actually. And gosh, that was probably a decade plus ago. And now here we are, yet fighting bad guys, at least for me on the West Coast. So yeah, Richard Seiersen, Chief Risk Technology Officer for Qualys. A little background on me. More recently, I was the Chief Risk Officer for a leading mid-market cyber insurance company. Prior to that, wandering CISO, GE, Twilio Lending Club, and others. I'm an entrepreneur, and written some books, and that's me. Now, listen, I think doesn't every company do a predictions thing, Alex? I mean, they come out of the woodwork, like hundreds of them every year, but I think this year's a little different. Let me tell you why. Because prediction markets are now like all the rage. I don't know if it's because Polymarket did their whole thing on 60 Minutes, but now everyone's like paying attention, and they're making all these bets on these big nation state events, or sporting events as well, nation state events, particularly with what's going on in the world. Like there's big markets on Greenland. I don't know if you saw that in Twitter, but it's really interesting. Those sort of markets, by the way, sometimes massively outperform experts, domain-specific experts, and significantly outperform things like AI. Again, it typically has to do with predictions where you're confronting some amount of irreducible uncertainty, right? That the only thing that might beat a prediction market in this case is astrology, but of course that doesn't work. So that being said, I'm super excited to jump in here and do a bunch of predictions with you. Next year, maybe we'll make some bets on this and see who wins big.
So we've got our first prediction, and Rich, I think it'd be cool if you maybe talk to us a little bit about this. What prediction is? That we'll say some controversial things. We'll both maybe have a little friction on camera, more off camera, and let's talk about this. So the prediction here is that AI is going to force cybersecurity risk management to become a continuous operating discipline. Maybe tell us a little bit. What does that mean? A continuous operating discipline?
Yeah, that's a lot of words there. So first of all, the question, isn't it already? Someone might say, well, you're here to tell me that it's not a continuous discipline. So I think the first thing, though, is to answer, what is it? What are we talking about? So again, I'm going to repeat the slogan here, and then I'm going to talk about what it is. So AI will force cybersecurity risk management to become a continuous operating discipline. Now, I don't mean to be overly pedantic, Alex, but I'm going to define what risk is, because I think it's one of those like hypnotic language patterns. Like these are not the droids you're looking for, and we ignore it. We don't really think about what does risk mean. So I'm going to define it for everyone. So risk is a state of uncertainty where some of the possibilities could lead to loss, catastrophe, or some other undesirable outcome. I'll say that one more time. So risk is a state of uncertainty where some of the possibilities could lead to loss, catastrophe, or some other undesirable outcome. By the way, that's a quote from one of the best risk management books that's dually useful for pressing flowers. Actually, it's from my first book, all right? So that's what risk is, a state of uncertainty where some of the possibilities could lead to loss. So then what actually is risk management? So risk management is the mitigation or transfer of the most plausible of those losses that would impact business objectives. I'll say that again. Risk management is the mitigation or transfer of the most plausible of those losses that would impact business objectives, right? By the way, I make the distinction between plausible and possible. There's endless possibilities in the world. We could have, space aliens show up. There could be, fire, earthquakes, lions, tigers, and bears. We're talking about the most plausible things given the context of your business. So what losses specifically are we really talking about in this case? So loss scenarios like business disruption, data breach, wire fraud, extortion, espionage. Second order losses like brand and reputational risk. We're looking at things like penalties, regulatory, civil, criminal. Financial losses are things specifically that hit your cash, so capital reserves, right? Opportunity loss. For example, you fail to meet certain requirements, be it audit requirements or whatnot, you're not able to do business any longer in a country or region or in a domain, and loss of market share. So all the stuff that your stakeholders care about, that's the losses. And so why does all this stuff I'm talking about need to be continuous? Reason being is that right now, in particular with the advent of AI, we as security practitioners are in exponential asymmetric warfare. So what I mean, on one end, we have the businesses that are digital and AI transforming. We've seen there's upwards $1 trillion+ have been spent on AI, and it continues. So that's digital and AI transformation on one side, right? That's our businesses. That's where all the money's going. And on the other side of us is we have sentient and now artificially intelligent adversaries, and we're stuck in the middle, right? So again, the business is putting all the investment into AI. The adversaries are getting new skills through AI, and we're stuck in the middle. So we, by very nature, have to move into a continuous practice of cybersecurity risk management. So I'm going to stop for a moment because I'm going to tell you how we do that, but I want to give you a chance, Alex, to perhaps say some words or counteract something I said or say something else.
Well, I think I've got two thoughts about this. So it's interesting, like working in the field of product security, a lot of this discipline is about like building safety systems and building kind of continuous evaluation and diagnostic systems that allow you to put policies in place to trigger certain rules, right? So for example, like I don't want to promote a release to a deployment for anything that might have a vulnerability that's like known affecting my product or like exploitable, or there's like, you know, a rootkit that's available for like common use, right? I would want to inform my pipeline to like fail those policies in place. So like we already have on some level, some operating model in at least the product security discipline that we should do these things. What I think is interesting is that there's a lot of people in the security space who are like really nervous about change. They like the static nature, I think, of their applications, right? So the idea that we should be doing daily deployments kind of is orthogonal with a lot of traditional security thinking. But the reality is that AI will force this to happen, right? Because we're going to have more code at higher release velocity, more feature requests, more functional requirements that are going to get integrated. And it's going to require us to build systems that become more comfortable with the fact that changes are going to happen at an ever increasing pace, right? I would even go so far as to say we want our changes to happen continuously so long as they exist inside the guardrails. And maybe one reason for that is because the more we make our code ephemeral, the less attackers can be successful because they're hard pressed to be persistent, right? When we continuously make changes, their persistence goes down. And so that gives us an asymmetry back in our pocket that generally has been taken away from us. The one thing I would challenge is I'm not so sold on the real impact that AI is going to have. I know that there's $500 billion of capital that these CEOs need to raise every year for the data centers that they need to build. And so they need to make it sound like it's going to be revolutionary and transformational. And I think it will be in some ways, but I'm still bullish, if you want my prediction. I'm still a little bit more bullish on the real impact of AI from what AI salesmen would tell me I should feel.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. By the way, on the continuous deployment, so my first, it was my second public CISO gig, and it was for the first cloud native company to be born and bred on AWS and go public. And when I started there 13, 14 years ago, they were doing 30,000 releases a year at that time. Totally. I've even seen people saying, hey, they think even the idea of repositories and Git and whatnot is going to go away. I think that's ridiculous in light of AI. But so back to in light of your statement and my point is that when it comes to cybersecurity risk management, when it comes to focusing on what you stand to lose, all the various losses are in place. Again, in light of asymmetric warfare, in light of digital transformation and AI transformation on one side, in light of both artificially intelligent and sentient adversaries on the other, how do we get ahead? How do you do this continuous thing? Now I'm going to play a little bit to my bias here. I think this is where the Risk Operations Center comes into place. So what is the Risk Operations Center? And we'll talk more about that today. It's a vendor agnostic practice and platforming approach to continuous cybersecurity risk management. So I'll say that again. The Risk Operations Center is a vendor agnostic practice and platforming approach to continuous cybersecurity risk management. Now, to be really practical for practitioners out there, you can think of the ROC in practice as CTEM, or Continuous Threat and Exposure Management. CTEM meets REMOps, or Remediation Operations, meets CRQ, Cyber Risk Quantification. So I'll say this again. You can think of a ROC as a platform in practice as CTEM meets REMOps meets CRQ, but orchestrated by agentic AI. And orchestration is a killer use case for agentic AI, taking all that grunt work and trying to remove all the friction. So this is where I think we're going to be forced to go in this direction, again, because of the asymmetry and because AI also allows us to change that asymmetry more in our favor. And again, I think that this whole practice area of the Risk Operations Center is going to be where we'll see a lot of this land.
I would agree. In fact, prediction 2 leads, I think, nicely into this. So the second prediction that we have is that federal cyber policy is going to push for a new kind of continuous monitoring. And that's going to include resiliency in AI and quantum, and a lot of it's going to be led by the private sector. So let me unpack that a little bit. But I had a very different career before I got into like real security operations and real cybersecurity leadership. I started my career after a brief stint in IT sales, working for the American Congress. I worked for the U.S. Congress for I think 5 or 6 years. And then I had the ability and the privilege to be able to continue my service working at the Department of Homeland Security and NIST and some other places. And so I used to be a Govy. I focused a lot on federal strategy, right? I lead our FedRAMP program here at Qualys and our other kind of public sector product and platform certification programs. And so a lot of my job is to try and unpack and understand what are going to be the requirements of kind of federal and government users? What is the policy that's driving that? And then where do we really want to lead them so that we can advocate for their best possible outcome? And I'll tell you that the intersection of that marries up very nicely with what Rich is talking about, because we've kind of gotten away in federal policy for a very long time from remembering that standards like FISMA or FedRAMP, the R stands for risk. Right? We've gotten away from remembering that these whole frameworks are here and they're purpose built to allow us to sit at that intersection between continuous threat management, right? Threat and exposure management, remediation operations. So the question of what ought we do at this specific point in time, and then CRQ, cyber risk quantification, which helps us drive and inform our priorities based on mission and in some cases revenue impact if you're in the private sector. What I find is interesting is 3 different data points that have all come out in the past year. First data point: the Department of Defense is attempting to move DISA and DISA authorized systems to adopt something called CATO, Continuous Authority to Operate. I'll unpack that in a moment. Separately from that, the FedRAMP program is trying to completely transform itself to get away from paperwork exercises and to get into the business of key risk indicator management instead. So instead of just like sending paper reports, what they would look at is monitoring specific key risk indicators in the underlying controls to determine if your program is actually efficacious or not. How does that marry up with CATO? The idea of continuous authority to operate is that for like our 421 FedRAMP high controls, or whatever the number is that's approximately it, we should be able to demonstrate compliance with each one of them and then build our systems in machine readable formats, attach evidence that can be continuously collected to show ground truth, and send that to our authorizing officials or regulators or auditors so that they can hold us accountable and have perfect or near perfect system information. If we get back to the idea of what is risk management that Rich talked about before, what they're unlocking there and accessing is the actual goals of risk management, right? Our ability to understand a state of uncertainty, answer that state of uncertainty with actual information, and then make a decision about how to manage, like transfer or accept or reject or mitigate based on that information. And that follows on in addition to what's happening in the European Union with the EU Cyber Resiliency Act, where now they're requiring reporting information on security incidents in real time as they happen, where they're requiring vendors to provide software bill of materials to show the dependencies that you're using so that they themselves can adjudicate the risk associated with this. And while these mandates may be coming from the government, it is private sector platforms that build the ability for you to deliver on those mandates. That's the thing that doesn't come from the government here. They're looking at companies like Qualys and others in the market to build a risk operations center capability so that you can leverage it to meet these changing and very new and very different government requirements. So the prediction that we have for this year is that not only will these take root, but they're going to start demanding delivery in this year for these types of mandates for key and critical systems. I think that's a reasonable expectation based on what leaders in the government have said and what we as commercial operators in this ecosystem are being made to attest to. Rich, thoughts, reactions, comments, feelings?
No, that was quite informative, Alex. And not to beat a dead horse, but it sounds very rockish. It sounds like the what they're asking for. I don't know if it's the nirvana state, but to be able to continuously not just monitor the state of controls and whatnot, but to understand risk, to understand loss, and to reduce uncertainty. This just very much lines up with the vendor agnostic thesis of a risk operations center. So that's great. We can go on to the next prediction.
Prediction 3. This is your bread and butter. Take it away.
All right. AI will expand business risk surface faster than most security teams can observe or govern. I'll say that one more time. It's fun to say. AI will expand business risk surface faster than most security teams can observe or govern. So I'm gonna have to unpack this because what on earth does risk surface even mean? I think it's a relatively new term in our corpus of risk words. So first, let's just talk about attack surface. Again, that's a term that we've been using in security for 25, 30 years. But again, I think it's one of those words that kind of gets leveled and we make some assumptions about what it means without really, actually knowing what it means. So attack surface. So consider this, you have assets, right? We have all kinds of assets, all your various nouns. So an asset obviously can have many vulnerabilities, right? And you can apply controls to your vulnerabilities. And then what is residual post-controls is your exposure. Threats or the bad guys fire off angry packets at your exposure. That leads to compromise. That whole process from asset to compromise is actually the domain that we live in security. If you were to go to RSA or Black Hat, any of those events, all those vendors are focused on helping you manage your attack surface. So then what is risk surface? So presupposing there's compromise only matters from a business perspective if there's actually some value at risk. Again, I'll say that again. You can have compromise all day long, and you do probably, by the way, just saying. But if you don't have any value at risk relative to that compromise, you actually don't have any impact. But even if you have financial impact, right? Meaning through business disruption, through data breach, through extortion, through wire fraud, pick your poison, right? If you have that impact, if you have risk transfer, typically to insurance, right? But something where you're transferring risk, it's really what's residual to that is your losses. And I'll explain this concretely. Think about a large European retailer. They end up getting ransomware and actually got into their VMware instances for their clouds. Their business they're a retailer, right? And so their business decomposes in two areas of making money. Brick and mortar make money and web retail make money. And so they had to actually shut down their web instances because of ransomware impact. And it was over 50 days of disruption. Now, again, I think like everyone else, I read all the blogs, all the articles, and what I saw was 300 million pounds of impact. Now, this is largely what you'd call opportunity loss. Money they couldn't make because their systems weren't working due to business disruption. Now, the good news in their case was they're cash flush. They've got great management. They had a new seat. Well, I don't know if it's that new. He's been there for like 6 years, I believe. And they were able to, they had risk absorption, right? Which is really important. You have your limit in insurance, but you also have your rainy day money. It helps you absorb risk. And they were in a very good cash position. But what's interesting is what we know, again, don't know this perfect, we're looking through a glass darkly here, is that they had an insurance limit of about, I believe it's 100 million pounds, right? So if it is true that they had 300 million pounds in losses, that means they 3x blew past their limit, which is pretty rare. So again, I go to this idea that what's residual ultimately to your various forms of risk transfer is what becomes really critical losses. Let's think of another real quick. I'm not picking on the UK here, but a large European auto manufacturer, as you probably know, Alex, they ended up not getting their insurance underwritten in time. They didn't have their policy. But if you think about it, they're a $400 billion, they're Fortune level company, $400 billion revenue company. They must have not had great risk absorption. I don't know. We're looking through a glass darkly here. The reason I say that is they had to take a $2 billion loan, 5-year loan from their government, right? $2 billion plus, whatever. Again, we don't know all the details. We're not boots on ground. That might have all been very perfect decision making, right? By the way, that was a supply chain risk, as you might know. But again, what's interesting is, what is risk surface? It's that stuff where you are having unexpected losses that really impact the business. You can call that the treasure zone. So the main group that's really concerned with risk surface is all your various stakeholders, your board, your investors, your E-team, right? These are the people who are almost exclusively concerned with risk surface. There's another august body that is almost exclusively concerned with risk surface. Alex, I'm going to ask you, do you know who that august body is? If you don't know, it's okay.
I mean, I would proffer it's probably your financial organization in your company. But if not, then security. Are those good guesses?
No, you're right and wrong. You're right in the first one. The first one's part of your business stakeholders.
Yep.
It's not security actually. It's the bad guys. The bad
Oh,
guys.
yeah, there you go.
But believe it or not, security like to think they're interested in attack surface. They're interested in treasure. The attack surface is just friction. They're almost exclusively when they're going to when ransomware gangs are going to do ransomware, they're thinking money. Trust me. Security is exclusively focused on attack surface. By the way, the bad guys want security to continue to be preoccupied with attack surface. Your business wants you to expand your focus actually to risk surface, right? So I know that's a lot of kind of pedantic stuff here to think about, but think about this now. You have an exponentiation of privileged, skilled, coordinated, seemingly chaotic actors now. If you think about AI, I'm going to say this again. You have an exponentiation of privileged, skilled, coordinated, seemingly chaotic actors. So for one thing, you have users who are now using AI, right? So people. But you have machine identities through agentic AI. So you have this exponentiation of privileged identities throughout your environment, right? And so these are people who are going to have access, and machines, they're going to have access to treasure. Because if you think about particularly what we're using agentic AI right now for in the enterprise, is we're using it to theoretically reduce overhead, human costs, by automating all the more of that with agentic AI. So it's going to be doing things like not just, through the browser, by the way, which is really interesting work, but they're, retrieval augmented generation, MCP, model context protocol, et cetera, accessing your SaaS stuffs, your CRM, your ERP, your ERM, all these, all payroll, whatever you have, all those things where you have human processes in place, you're going to have all these agents they're orchestrating together to do work. So this becomes a big problem from a risk surface perspective for us. And the reason why it's a particularly big problem for security is most all of our security investments are syntactically based. So again, I'll say this again. Most of our inline and host-based controls, most all of them are syntactically based. Prompts are semantic based, right? Meaning based. So a lot of the investments that we have may not be as effective when the actual attack vector is semantic as opposed to syntactic. I know that's a lot of words. I'll let you jump in here as well. Hopefully it makes sense. Ask AI to summarize it. Maybe it'll make sense.
I mean, I think like you're coming at this with a healthy perspective, right? Of like, well, what do the attackers really want you to do? And what are you currently focused on programming in your operations? And then what new risk does AI introduce? I think a lot of us are really focused on like what new opportunity it introduces, which is true. It introduces to some extent a lot of opportunities for productivity, for speed, for scale, for analysis, for augmentation of human capabilities. Also, it has access to key systems and information, and has the ability to compile information from lots of different sources that may have different privileged management boundaries around them. And now you have one agent that you can centrally communicate with that has access to lots of different, or multiple agents, right? But that have access to protected enclaves of information. And they're only protected right up until the point when you can just access the agent or the MCP server that has access to all of that. And now your boundary falls away, right? So, the information piece is, I think, one part of it. The other one is like we have to give these agents privilege. We have to give these MPC servers privilege, right, in order for them to do their job. Many of the times these privileges that they require or are asking for are relatively extensive. And while we may have like human in the loop in some aspects of that, right, in a lot of other aspects we don't. So these capabilities of access to information, capabilities to have access to systems, and most security teams can barely even enumerate which applications have AI in them at all, where and how is AI being deployed, what are the controls and governance around them, how do we know that that's true, how can we test that and deterministically validate that, right? So yes, I actually completely agree with this, even though I'm bullish on AI more than others, because I think it's like we have to right size our appetite with what I think is a reasonable expectation of delivery. My concern is the same here, I think, as yours, which is that this genuinely does expand our risk surface in ways that most people aren't even calculating.
Yep.
So extremely fair point. Do you think we're going to see in 2026 like a major event based on like the lack of privilege management or the lack of general AI governance?
Well, I don't know what a major event is. I'm sure we've had death by 1,000 slices already with people just taking data that's either PII, potentially PHI, NPI, and putting it into ChatGPT and other things, not being aware of the fact that they're dealing with public SaaS systems, and now that data is permanently written into the training set. So, I think a lot of losses probably already happened. Reminds me back in the day when I was at Kaiser Permanente a long time ago, and we were. This is when Kamala Harris actually was the AG, and she was very concerned with privacy. It was one of her big things, and rightly so.
Sure.
And our CISO regularly had the opportunity to go and visit with her because of the death of 1,000 little slices, where you just had. This is back in the day when you didn't have encrypted hard drives, and people were just putting their laptops in their cars. And this is Oakland. You know anything about Oakland or Oaktown? Is like, smash and grab was the big thing. Well, I would liken that to this now. It's very, very similar. The observability thing, it just goes back to this idea of syntax versus semantics. You can't observe the semantic attack and how it could be composed over time. It's just very difficult. Anyways, we can go on to the next one, but yeah.
Cool.
I'm very excited about AI. No one think I'm not a downer on AI. I spend my whole day playing with that. I love it.
Totally. Yeah, I like to I don't know. My view on it is don't be overly optimistic, right? Wait for the delivery of the amazing outcome we're all being promised, and then evaluate whether or not that was correct. Speaking of which, our next prediction 4. I'll own this one. I think this one will be kind of interesting because it speaks a little bit to this, which is radical transparency is bold and much needed in 2026. So let me kind of talk about what this means. It's interesting both as a producer of software and a consumer of software, much like I imagine many of you are who are watching this. My expectations have changed, and I'm sure that yours have too, based on our collective experience as security people, right? So what does that kind of mean here? What are the points that we're trying to get at? So what's interesting is that, and I'll take our own case example. At Qualys, I've had the pleasure of leading product security here for three and a half years. When I started here, it was a somewhat common occurrence, common being like, once every like month to 2 months, that we would get an inquiry from a customer saying, hey, I'm using your product and we have questions about the state of affected status of vulnerabilities. Can you help us understand which of these vulnerabilities actually apply to your product? That happened like once or twice a month in like 2022, 2023 timeframe. Now we're responding to hundreds of these requests every 6 months, 6 to 8 months. And what I find is that this trend is nothing to do with us, but it is everything to do with software supply chain. There is an increasing need for a way that we change how we communicate about software safety in our industry. I think it started a lot with the great work that Alan Friedman and the crew at NIST and NTIA and CISA did on software bill of materials. The problem is that SBOMs actually create new problems. When I provide you with an SBOM, then you come back with lots of questions, and I need a different mechanism to answer these questions. That's been the learning by Red Hat and by Canonical and by Microsoft and by Oracle, all maintainers of great operating systems we know and love and use every day. And their collective wisdom has started a project by the OASIS Foundation, a standards body, called VEX, the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And it has with it these kind of 4 status messages, which are increasingly common to be asked for by major organizations if you're a producer of software. And these status messages are things like, for example, affected by vulnerability, not affected by vulnerability, under investigation, right? Or we've fixed this in a different version. And these are machine readable status messages that we can trade back and forth to communicate with each other. And in the case where a vulnerability does not affect the product, then we can explain the reason why with one of 5 different status messages. And I won't bore you with all of them, but they're things like vulnerable code not in the execution path, or vulnerable library not called. And there are a few others, and you're welcome to look them up on your own. But what this is getting at is a place in which consumers of software increasingly expect producers of software to be transparent about the security posture of that software. And increasingly, they want that in machine-readable, automatable formats in which they can self-service to get answers to these questions. And so my prediction in 2026 is that you're going to start seeing many other mid-market software producers be made by the market, be made by their customers to adopt this line of thinking. And I'll say for my own part, I'm leading our product security advisories program here at Qualys, and we're adopting this trend too. And I see colleagues of mine at our competitors and at our colleagues and others in the market doing the same as well. And if we get back to one of the reasons for this, right, it's what the Cybersecurity Reliability Act in the EU is getting at, which is you need to tell us proactively about the state of security posture of your software, right? If you're having an incident, we expect you're going to tell us while it's happening. We're expecting disclosures and updates while they're happening, right? Not like, hey, last week we had an incident and this is the RCA and we produced a report, and if you have any further questions, email support. It's more like what Cloudflare is doing, which is a real-time status page that tells their customers about the status of incidents as they are happening so that they can both participate in the remediation, which I know sounds crazy, but many of us have lots of intelligence and information that we'd be happy to share because we gather and collect these things, and we have our own tradecraft and tactics and procedures that we can aid and abet our colleagues at companies like Cloudflare in remediating exploitation on key systems that we ourselves use, right? So there are moral goods to do these things. There are also practical goods and reasons why we do these things, right? And our objective here, I think, in the reality of where the market is that governments and markets will make software producers transparent whether they want to or not about the state of security posture of their products. And I think in 2026, we're going to see a major cybersecurity incident at a major vendor in which they will be transparent about the ongoing remediation operations of that activity. That's my prediction in this year. We already saw something like that last year, a little bit with an incident at Cloudflare, which they did a remarkable job at managing, and hats off to that team for their great work. We're proud partners with them. But I think the impact will be that those things will become norms and more standard operating procedures in our industry. And maybe that's just me as a customer advocate wanting that to happen, but we have good evidence to see that the market and governments are going to make that happen.
Very good. I'm going to talk about the Risk Operations Center concept Yet
Yeah.
again, because when you're the defender, when you're the person you're on the receiving end of the supply chain, and all of a sudden there's, let's say, some supply chain risk, a 0-day nastygram, whatever it might be, and maybe there's no patch, right?
Sure.
Hopefully when there's a broad disclosure, it's with there's patch and everyone's done the right thing. But sometimes it happens. But the question then becomes, oh, all right, well, in the context of my business, is this actually exploitable, given my inline and host-based controls? And
Totally.
by the way, and even if it is exploitable, getting back to this idea of compromise, is it associated with value at risk? I get the idea of lateral movement and things like that, but given all the context, given the relevant attack paths, as it were, inline, host-based controls, treasure that's potentially available, is this thing actually at risk? And this even goes into the idea of actually testing your controls, actually doing, through non-violent or non-lethal attacks, confirming whether or not these things, be it local segment or cross segments or whatnot, is this thing actually, can it be compromised? So as a defender, not having to be held hostage to this. So that's another thing. The purpose of the Risk Operations Center in architecture is that, again, you're bringing all your nouns, your assets together, considering your host space and inline controls, call it breach and attack simulation, or some variant where we have this new thing called True Confirm, which you're probably aware of, right? We're not only across the network with scanners, but actually taking agents and, be they on host or whatnot, and able to use those, be it same segment or otherwise. But trying to get high fidelity. Is this thing compromisable? And is there value at risk? And one of the interesting metrics, by the way, in this area is really and this came from our CEO, which I love this one, which is your average weaponization of exploit, or average weaponization of exposure. Excuse me, average weaponization of exposure, where you can have a disclosure, 0-day exposure, which typically would be that at least there's proof of concept, or there might be some evidence of there having been exploit. That's different than commoditization of exploit, where
Totally.
there's nothing bespoke anymore. Where there's a line in the sand where you have multiple threat actors, threat intelligence have confirmed, fully weaponized, and it's really in that window, right? In that window where you have that average. There's basically this average time to weaponization and your average time to remediate just your 0 days. There's this window between that 0-day remediation, or what it could not be 0-day. It could be any sort of critical, nastygram.
Sure.
But your actual remediation, your MTTR, if you like, mean time to remediate, and the mean time to weaponization, that window there, right? So the question then becomes, not only can we have visibility into whether something's really exploitable or not, but if it is, how good are we at closing that window, and where are our capabilities or whatnot, and being able to be at least even internally transparent about that. I think a lot of people don't know how to do that now. But this is the whole promise of a risk operations center in practice, is being able to look at all that rich context. Again, being able to use AI for orchestration, what have you, and get to that place where we can start understanding, what is that window of risk and opportunity, and are our capabilities over time, that call it a KPI or KRI, if you like, is that really that surface, is it getting smaller to reduce opportunity? So I just, when you mentioned all that stuff, I thought about, hey, what about us who are on the receiving end of the supply chain and
Yeah.
right? So,
Well, one of the reasons why I like this so much is because I think they're philosophically consistent, right? If risk is a state of uncertainty, then a status message by a producer helps me at least address that state of uncertainty and potentially minimize that state of uncertainty, right? I think the problem that we've all seen is that because like 51 or 52% of all CVEs are now critical and high, right? That leads us to these non-productive states. And so what we should be hunting for is less about, well, what is the vulnerability score, and more about like, well, what is my exposure here to this vulnerability? I'm fine, especially for non-critical systems, having critical vulnerabilities on those systems that have no exploit or cannot be reached, or the conditions under which they could be reached. I have a resistance strength that is high in my technical or compensating controls. All of that works. We know that model works. The Risk Operations Center helps us action on that, right? That's, I think, the value of it. And frameworks like the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange help us use machine readable formats to make that highly automatable and highly effective. So prediction for number 4 is that we're going to see more of these adoptions of things like VEX, and more of these things like, incident response transparency brought to us both by government mandates and market requirements in 2026. Which leads us to our 5th prediction, and Rich, I know this is a big one for you. Yeah. Cyber insurance will see a moderate hardening, but with a caveat. So tell us more about this.
All right, I got to unpack this. So just, by the way, just a reminder about my background. Yes, serial recovering CISO and whatnot, but chief risk officer in cyber insurance. And I'll just, since we're talking about me, I'll say even a little bit more.
Can't be stopped.
Yep. My first book is the only security book to date that's been required reading by the Society of Actuaries exam prep. And they do have wild parties, just in case you were wondering, Alex. So, get out there with the actuaries. So cyber insurance, why would a practitioner even care about cyber insurance? You might think, I don't care. Well, you care because cyber insurance, 99 times out of 100, is bought by your CFO, by the way. Sometimes by the GC, maybe chief risk officer, but typically by the CFO. And you can think of it this way: they're buying insurance as a financial firewall to protect cash, like to protect money that they want to use for maybe other things, maybe for a rainy day, maybe for an opportunity, whatever. That the idea is, hey, look, I want to put a financial firewall here so this stuff doesn't get touched. So it's really important to them. Now, the idea is that, again, they want the reality is your CFO and particularly your insurer, they don't want you even coming close to that limit. Like they want you to use controls to prevent that from happening. So if you're a CISO or someone who's in security work, you've probably time and time again got those awful questionnaires from brokers and underwriters where you're answering all these onerous questions about your program. You're doing that because these insurers, they want to know whether or not you're a good bet. Right. So now everyone understands what happens, right? Now, what's going on right now? Right now, it's a buyer's market. Think of like buying a house. There's a buyer's market and there's a seller's market. When it's a buyer's market, the buyer has all the power, right? When it's a seller's market, the seller has all the power. So roll back 5 or 6 years ago, it was a seller's market in insurance where they could come to you with like a 1,000-page questionnaire and give you like really bad terms. Like, here, this is really expensive insurance, and the value, the amount of coverage or limit you're going to get for that is going to be relatively small. That is not that's not how it is right now. Right now, it's a good time to be buying insurance. It's what we call a soft market, or again, a buyer's market. So the brokers and whatnot, when they go and try to sell insurance, they can't put a lot of friction in that process, because you as a buyer will go, well, you're making this hard for me. I don't have to do that. I'm going to go buy it from somewhere else. That's at the same time, the insurance industry, the carriers, the money, that big, there's a lot of dry powder there. They want to move money in, right? They want to do that, but they don't want to make bad bets at the same time. Meaning, we call it loss ratios. Think about it, security folks. You have losses, financial losses, claims you make, right? That's over your premiums. Think of a ratio. Premiums, what you bought it for, and they want to keep that ratio relatively low. If the insurance industry does that, they're winning. They're getting bonuses, and they're going to Cancun and whatnot. So now you know like a lot that's going on. So why does this matter to you? I think this is slowly but surely going to change. We're already starting to see policies specific to AI and security, like new innovation. This is in insurance, they call these new products. They have their own, by the way, it's this really weird world that will be unrecognizable to you if you ever got involved with it. It's really strange people. But so they have these policies. What I think is going to start happening, and this goes to some of the things, Alex, you were saying, I do think we're going to start seeing some serious events. Again, because a lot of the security investments we have are against syntactically based, not based on meaning semantics. We have a lot of, call it black ops, or people with browsers who are using AI, and you have developers who are using AI where it's, again, it's writing its own code and doing things for the purpose of accessing your crown jewels. For the purpose of, so your crown jewel will offer MCP up as an API, so I can go talk to my CRM, my ERP, my EMR, purchasing, whatever, right? But those are crown jewel assets for businesses. These are the businesses. They are operationally what make the business go. If an ERP system goes down for a manufacturer, like undoubtedly is largely probably what happened with Marks and Spencer's in part, you have large breaches and loss of capital opportunity in the millions in their case, in the case of billions, right? So, so what's going to happen is I think we're going to see a few of those, and we'll see hardening. There's two things that cause hardening. There's macroeconomics things that go beyond our ability to reason about, right? Like you'll see the hardening of security the same time you see hardening of property and casualty. It'll happen. You'll go, why did that happen? And you'll see softening. You'll go, oh, I got a better rate because I'm really good at security, and they're like, they'll tell you, your brokers will say, yeah, that is because of you, but it's not. It's not because of you. It has nothing to do with you. It has to do with macroeconomic things that are going on. But I think this is going to change. We're going to start seeing changes with AI. And again, I'll go back to those people who are very good at being able to determine the state of control, going back to this idea of the risk operations center. These are the folks who are going to have, I think, the greatest advantage.
All right, so this last one, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about, but I think the prediction's real. The prediction here is that AI is going to push security operations towards attack path driven risk prioritization. And I think this is correct, but let's first talk about like what attack path risk driven prioritization is. Maybe let's also modify it slightly to include some other things in its normal kind of corpus of knowledge. And let's talk about why it's important and how AI may or may not really make this prediction come true. So attack path driven risk prioritization is a lot of words. It's a big statement. Let's take it in its two separate parts. The first piece is an attack path, right? Security people generally understand what attack paths are. This would be, like essentially the systems through which an attacker would progress, oftentimes in serial, from point A to point B so that they can take action on objectives. So for example, this might be something like exploitation of a web server that allows you into some kind of middleware system like Kafka or some event-driven architecture that gives you access to a database. Your objective is to get this information in the database. And so the attack path helps you understand how an attacker may progress from a simple cross-site scripting event to drop into or through into that web server to ultimately get information out of the database with privilege that they should not be able to get. That is a toy example. There are a lot of interesting, complex examples for attack paths. I think there's some interesting parts here, though, that are important to unpack about just the value of attack paths in themselves. We tend to find that there is a lot of hype in the marketing language around attack paths, and I'll even say to some extent every vendor, even this vendor, may use some level of hype to kind of promote the efficacy of that product. I think the thing that makes
Speak for yourself, Alex.
I always do. But I think what's important is the value that attack paths give us, right? Which is they give us some level of certainty or new information about how to locate the problem and test the controls that we may or may not have in place against the type of attacks that attackers may or may not launch given that attack path, right? So what this helps us do is understand the resistance strength of our controls against the tactics, techniques, and procedures of attackers. This is not the only type of way to model and simulate and to validate the efficacy of controls. Another one, I'll give a shout out to a colleague, Kelly Shortridge, a wonderful author, really effective book on security chaos engineering. It tells us things like you should run experiments to determine whether or not these controls actually work the way that you think that they might, right? And so this brings us into the breach and attack simulation market or chaos engineering markets. And essentially the ideas are all very similar, though the techniques may be different. The idea is I have a hypothesis. I will test this hypothesis using the scientific method to help me determine what might happen and what might go wrong in a real world simulation. Some people call this shift right. Some people call this chaos engineering. Attack paths have less to do with actually exploitation and more about analysis. But I think the real value here of this prediction is that we can take these concepts and help drive risk prioritization on how we ought manage controls and how we might implement controls. One of the things that we need to do is understand that AI does indeed change the attack surface. I think we talked about that in prediction 2 or 3. I think it was prediction 3. So we know that AI will change the attack surface, increase velocity, new types of technologies, new privileges, new integration points. But what we also know is that they introduce new tactics, techniques, and procedures that we need to be able to prioritize against. Here's the other thing we know. We also know that controls cost money. They also cost opportunity, and sometimes controls cause problems. They don't just solve problems, right? So what our prediction here is that there will be maturity in this ecosystem that is going to be forced by the reality of AI and also the desires of customers to get a more effective test and evaluation capability that helps them understand not just what to do, but how to prioritize doing that against doing other things. Similar concept, by the way, an intersection to the Risk Operations Center, which is I have this state of uncertainty. I have a remediation operations capability. I have this threat and exploitation capability, and I have cyber risk quantification to help me financially make these decisions or put my money where my mouth is. This is a different flavor on how to achieve that outcome, something that is becoming increasingly popular in European and ASEAN markets. We expect to see this increase in the adoption in the North American markets over this year as these capabilities become a little bit more vibrant, maybe a little bit sexier, maybe a little bit marketed well. So that's my take on this prediction. Rich, what's your take on this prediction?
Yes.
Love it.
Yes to all that. I'll add a little bit too. Earlier, I talked about the distinction between possibility and plausibility, right? The possible versus the plausible. I'm just going to talk briefly about the possible. So I used to ran security operations across the U.S. for a massive healthcare provider that at the time was Cisco's largest customer in their largest market by a long shot. They're also Microsoft's largest customer, largest market globally by a long shot too. And they had a flat network. So let's imagine for a moment that you have a flat network, a company, an enterprise. Let's say that enterprise only has 10,000 hosts, nodes, whatever you like. And let's say each one has a modicum of TCP and UDP services running. It's a flat network though. If you were to drop let's say you start at any one point and you were to test any one point, we're going to say, okay, we're going to make 4 moves. That can be moves within that host and potentially to another host. Maybe it's scanning the network, maybe it's listening, maybe whatever it might be. I'm going to give you 4 actions you can take, assuming that I just randomly swirled around, picked up one of those hosts by the hair, and held it up, and you get the test. And then to try to test all of those. So again, enumerating 4 attack paths. You're talking about billions of operations. Even with AI and putting your servers in Greenland so that they can cool really well, it's not going to happen for you. It's outside of the scope of reality to assume that AI is going to be able to enumerate every single attack path over time in real time. I know we like to think about that. That's fun to say. I'm sure the folks at ChatGPT say, well, of course it can. That's just because they don't understand the nature of the domain, so they can't be trusted. But if we talk about the plausible, meaning where because we are using other information, for example, we know where our value of risk, so we have to constrain the problem. We know where our value at risk is. We understand, going back to those SaaS systems that run the business, right? We understand what that is. We understand the state of control inline host space to a certain extent. So we can mathematically start constraining the problem. We can start getting at this a little closer, where again, AI can help with some amount of enumeration. It's still a very difficult problem. So that was the possibility versus plausibility. I'll talk about some things that we're doing practically. This is in my other hat as the Chief Risk Technology Officer on the modeling side. So this is getting into advanced kind of fancy stuff. I'll try to simplify it. And this is where AI is helping a lot, like where LLMs in particular are super good. I was just doing this morning. Anyone can do this. There's nothing challenging about this. But taking MITRE ATT&CK, and so enumerating, MITRE ATT&CK has both his list of threats, and you have a list of MITRE mitigations as well, a bunch of different things. But you can take these and you can actually say, hey, AI, sew these together. So like think of a Sankey, if you like. But then you can say, all right, I'm interested in the NIST CSF 2.0 the subcategory, so the subcontrols. Like NIST 853 maps under there. I think I want to get the subcontrol, which there's 100 and something of those. and map those, the many-to-many mapping into Sankey so from there you map those controls to the mitigations, to the threats. And then going back to this idea of value at risk. So I talked about business disruption, data breach, wire fraud, all the things that anything that you would see in an insurance policy they're insured for. And this is important for the CFO. Then map that to that. So you have a mapping from a controls framework, any controls framework. I just chose NIST. Doesn't matter. It could be CIS,
Sure.
ISO, whatever. But so you're mapping from there to the mitigations, to the actual threats, and then to the treasure. And then on the far left, you can say, all right, I have these N investments from the enterprise perspective, where it's Qualys, the MDR, or sorry, I'll mention some other vendor, CNAP. We've got a great CNAP, by the way, but I want to include others. Some sort of identity vendor, blah blah blah. Some great firewall vendor that's very fancy. All of those. So you can list those that you might have and your wish list as well, and use AI. Since this is a very LLM thing, start to map those things together and start looking at, okay, how can I start doing some sense making now, where I then start bringing in my CTEM information, the real state of my environment, with again the CRQ data for the value at risk. Now I can start getting an idea of what really matters. So again, the idea is really constraining the problem set. That's really, from a mathematical perspective.
Absolutely.
Honestly, you really want to, so that sort of stuff. So when you get resourceful, now AI can do a lot of things, but if you don't understand your domain, you don't understand, you don't have a strong concept of measurement, you don't understand your objectives, where you're going after, right? So concept, object, and the methods of measurement. If you don't know how to do this stuff, and it's not data science, it's reasoning. If you're not sure how to do that and apply it to security, this will be very difficult. I don't care how much AI you have. But the reality is we can start constraining these things in a real way, given working with a real customer, and start building models that help us make more sense of what to do when, be it in terms of investments, be it in terms of remediation operations, be it in terms of doing nothing, right? And so I'm pretty excited about what this brings to the fore.
Just to share with you, Rich, parenthetically, as a product security leader, one of the challenges that I have to deal with is making our software highly resistant to effective attacks by attackers. So, like one of the metrics that I use, even if it's qualitative, right? Is it more or less expensive now than before to exploit Qualys product and customers? This is like a key way that I look at my domain, that I look at my job. And one of the things that I found was I did a similar exercise. I mapped the most common MITRE attack framework TTPs against the volumetric database for the National Vulnerability Database. And what I asked for it to do was extract to me for the top most critical vulnerabilities, what are the most common CWEs, the common weakness and enumerations that make that software enumeratable or exploitable, which causes it to get a CVE, right, and map that against the tactics, techniques, and procedures found in MITRE to help me understand what are the software flaws that are leveraged the most by attackers to cause the most amount of damages. And then based on that, we build, because I run our Secure by Design program, we build a program to help us eliminate whole classes of vulnerabilities in our software, right? And this helps us more accurately and effectively target our ask to engineering to deliver safe products to customers. And based on that, we're hunting for 5 specific CWEs in our classes of Cloud Agent products to make that increasingly resistant to attack and make it really expensive for attackers to be successful. This type of thinking and leveraging AI is now able to be vibe coded, right? And is now able to be leveraged by persons like myself for small amounts of investment, where before we would be stupefied on how to solve this problem at scale. How do I get all of this data? How do I make sense of this information? I think AI delivers that kind of risk-based prioritization, but your point stands. You have to know your domain, what questions to ask, and be able to reason against it well. I think my prediction here is that there's going to be a lot of waste in this space until people can do this more efficiently. I don't think that's a ground-shaking truth, but I think we will get better as a society at doing this.
And that's great. Yeah, it's just this is just LLM stuff, not even getting into agentic AI. I'll just
Totally.
add what we're doing along these lines as well is so for our models that run. We have the industry's kind of largest loss database. When I say losses, financial losses, both in terms of the rate with which various events happen across industries. So the same data set that your largest insurers and brokers use. So we've purchased that. We have that in our data. So we mix that with the industry's largest if you like, CTEM database, exposure database, which is Qualys. So bringing that sort of data together with models like this that are now accessible. I mean, you can do that work you just articulated and I articulated if you want to hire about 10 people to work for 6 months, or you can say AI do it,
Yeah.
but being able to then bring that together to help really, again, going back to what you're really talking about is prioritization, reducing the need to chase our tails and focusing on those things that actually matter. So instead of that saying, here's 60 million things you're not going to need to do, down to here are the smaller set, the really less than 1% of that total that really matter right now that are going to protect the business. And I would say this is at the heart of a risk operations center. It's really, in one sense, it's about saying, hey, yes, let's bring more data in and better analytics so we can reduce the amount of unnecessary work and focus on those things that protect the business. With that, Alex, we are way over time and we need to say bye-bye.
Everyone saw that coming.
Yeah.